This is Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock examine Professor Stump's Chapter 56, The Problem of Evil, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
There's one particular text, and I can't remember which one it is now. I preached on it one time, that the entire text in the original Greek is produced as a single sentence. And when I told the congregation that I was preaching on, there were people who were,
Well, my friend, let me double check with you. I think we are still in the problem of evil. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think we had kind of done an intro to it, and we were going to kind of get into some of the rest of the chapters.
That's right. That's right. And I think we floated the idea that it's at least worth considering whether or not the problem of evil is actually a problem, in the sense that is it really a contradictory state of affairs versus falling short of the kind of world that humans would expect to live in if they were created by a quote-unquote good God. And so that was an interesting sort of way to develop that. And we did talk about Augustine. Now, Gregory the Great is one of the other people that's mentioned here in the chapter. And Gregory was thinking about this in the context of his commentary on the biblical book of Job. And Chuck, I know that you would probably agree there is discussions about suffering in the scriptures, and very positive ones, and edifying, and sheds a lot of light on what's happening. And yet the book of Job seems to be a canonical place to look at, and where the Bible sort of canonically deals with what's happening here. Now, I think it's fair, even if we're not prepared to admit that there is a such thing as an actual logical contradiction with the existence of evil and with the government and administration by a good God. Professor Stump points out that Gregory notes that the ways of providence are often hard to understand. And I think this subject really is humbling, because the accountant inside of us, the bookkeeper who wants to track the entries in the ledgers of time and have the books balance out, we have to puzzle at this. And Professor Stump is talking about Gregory doing the same thing. He puzzled over the way in which suffering and prosperity are distributed in the world. He confessed himself mystified about how to square that distribution with the existence of a perfectly good God. And Gregory talks about the mystery of this situation. And you'll hear people a lot introduce that topic, this idea of mystery. And we have to ask if that's even a fair or legitimate response. Now, Chuck, if you and I were able in real time capture all the events in history, write down the entries in the book, balance the ledgers, as it were, according to some form of ethical accounting principles, then theoretically we would naively expect that there would be a logic, a rhyme, a reason, a pattern that we ourselves could discern. But Chuck, history flies by so fast. Who can keep the books? And so right away, I think we have to acknowledge that this type of issue could very well be beyond our pay grade. And I think Gregory's pointing that out. Now, there was an interesting twist Stump talks about with Gregory, and that is Gregory was perhaps not so much thinking about the problem of evil in the same sense that we moderns might think of it. In other words, modern thinkers, it seems, would typically like to put God on trial and ask him to account for why did he do this, why did he do that, in particular the distribution of pain and suffering, divine judgment. But the twist here with Gregory is that, and he writes this, holy people, that is to say, Christian believers, are more fearful of prosperity in this world than of adversity. Let me read that again. Holy people are more fearful of prosperity in this world than adversity. Wow. And I think there's really something insightful here with Gregory. I forget which chapter it is in Deuteronomy, but there's one of the chapters when God says in the recapitulation of the law that he's giving to Israel, when you come into this good land that I'm giving to you, do not let the goodness of this land, the prosperity into which I've brought you, do not let these things pull your heart away from me, because, well, it's going to want to do that. And that's in fact what happens with Israel. Israel as a nation has it so good under the government of God that eventually the prosperity just becomes almost the occasion by which the nation of Israel hardens its heart against God. And so Gregory's idea here is that if he's in a situation where he feels too prosperous, and I don't think Gregory's talking in a sadistic fashion here when he says this next point, but he says when adversity is in their lives, they cannot help but wonder whether or not they are to be counted among the wicked. Of course, I read that the opposite way. When adversity is not in their lives, they cannot help but wonder whether or not, after all, they are to be counted among the wicked. For that reason, prosperity is more frightening to them, to believers, than adversity. Now, obviously, there's a sadistic sense that this could be taken. I don't think Gregory's going there. I've perhaps heard it put in a contemporary setting by Christian preachers that beware of promises of prosperity for your life, for that's the very sort of reward that the devil himself offers his servant. And again, I don't think we mean this in a sadistic sense, and I don't think that we take two people who are believers in Christ, and I don't think we look at person A, who's had a very prosperous and good life, and then look at him with dishonor, and then look at person B who's suffered and had a lot of tragedy, and say, aha, clearly this is the better situation to be in. I just think it's something we have to acknowledge and recognize that suffering, the scriptures are so unambiguously clear that God uses suffering as a tool, as an instrument for accomplishing his purpose of making his people what he wants them to be. That in a second sense, the problem of evil is not even a problem in that sense, in that particular usage. So, Chuck, that was intense. How does that bounce off or track with what you were thinking when you were reading that part of it?
I was really impressed when I read through this a second time, just to review, at how important this idea is that there may be a positive, there may be benefits to suffering. And in fact, perhaps we see that part of the problem in our modern society is not necessarily a concern with the problem of evil per se, but the problem of suffering. And that there is a real sense that in today's modern world, we conflate the two things. We conflate evil and suffering as if they are entirely the same thing. And perhaps all that is evil is human suffering. All that human suffering is evil. And the more I read through this chapter, the more I realized that we can't conflate those two things. Suffering is sometimes the result of evil. Suffering sometimes is not evil. Sometimes there is a higher purpose to suffering. And perhaps the medievals understood that in a way that we have lost. And that's why Gregory the Great's comments here seem so strange to us, where it's even hard to read it the right way, as you pointed out. Now, I don't want to turn this into, just like you've said, we don't want to just move to some sort of idea of asceticism for the sake of asceticism. We shouldn't hope for more and more intense suffering as somehow being evidence of our righteousness, just as in the same way we wouldn't want to hope for more and more prosperity as being the only evidence of our righteousness. But I think it is important to note that there are some benefits to suffering, and perhaps the problem of evil as it's seen in the modern world is really not about the problem of evil. Now, let's not forget that there still is an issue. We have to talk about why is there evil in the world, but we shouldn't totally take evil and have it be summed up in suffering. And Stump points out in this section right after her discussion of Gregory the Great on the medieval standard of value that Gregory's worldview was common in the Middle Ages, even if it's very uncommon today. But it really gets at something that I think we still talk about, at least as Christians. We still spend a lot of time with the understanding that what we as Christians are really looking for is union with Christ. A lot of theologians spend a lot of time talking about what does that mean? What is union with Christ? And I think the medievals understood that there is a real benefit to having a personal relationship. Now, again, we can get into all sorts of issues. I think there are some modern ways in which we twist this idea of a personal relationship. But the medievals understood, just as we Christians today understand, that it is possible for a human to be united with God. And in fact, the greatest good for a human is to be in that personal relationship with God. And that's a personal relationship that is, it contains love for each other, faith. It's not just simply, it's got all these different aspects to it. And to some extent, what we look forward to in the new heavens and the new earth is an even greater union with God, because God will be among us in the new heavens and the new earth. And we will be able to commune with him in ways that just aren't even possible yet in this world. And yet in this world, we also have that possibility of a shared, loving, personal relationship with God. And Stump points out that the medievals, Aquinas and others, and including some non-Christians, some Jewish thinkers, really understood that if the core of who we are and the core of what's best for humanity is that relationship with Christ, then in this world where sin and evil still exist, where because of sin, that union is imperfect and is broken, and in fact can be permanently broken through our own sin, our own desires, our own failing to do what it is that we are to do, then there is a role for suffering in preventing that. It's there to help us to remind us. It gives us it trains us. It's that no pain, no gain that you often hear from your track and cross country coaches who say, look, you got to train hard, you got to run hard, no pain, no gain. And we understand that there is a way that the suffering does that for us. It's character building. It trains us in being better at working towards that relationship, that unity with Christ. And later the Jewish scholar Saadia Gaon makes a comment about that. He says that although these may be painful for human beings, hard, wearying, and troubling of mind, all this is for our own good. And he quotes Job, where the prophet says, the chastening of the Lord, my son, despise not. Now, and then Saadia talks about some other ways in which suffering can develop that unity with God. He talks about salvation and punishment, not only making a good person better, but really keeping a person who's done something bad from getting worse and helping them to rectify accounts, that suffering as punishment can be a good thing. And then there's the suffering like Job's, trial and testing that comes to an upright servant who knows he's going to bear sufferings that are loosed upon him and will be subjected to certain sufferings, so that when he steadfastly bears them, his Lord may reward and bless him. This too is a kind of bounty and beneficence, for it brings the servant to everlasting blessedness. And that's a quote from Saadia as well. And so what we have here is this understanding that suffering is not the same as evil. In fact, suffering can be a good. And all that is to say that if we conflate those two things, I think we make a real mistake. And I think that may be part of the problem of the modern world, is that if we think that all that is evil in the world is simply suffering, we miss it on multiple accounts, because we then miss things that are evil. We don't recognize them, that don't produce suffering. In fact, some evil things can often produce, in some ways, at least temporarily, the opposite of suffering. But there is also then suffering that is good for us. And I just found, I'll be honest, I had read through this chapter several times, but then after having been sick, I needed to go back and remind myself in preparation for today. And I just really was struck very much by what Professor Stump wrote here about suffering. And even though she has this discussion in terms of a chapter entitled The Problem of Evil, in some ways, we do have to separate out evil from suffering and recognize that they're not the same thing.
And Chuck, I want to affirm that. First of all, thank you for making that point. There's a nuance here that we have to acknowledge. Evil and suffering, while possibly linked, we shouldn't think of them as the same thing in all cases. In fact, if it's okay to share this, you're talking with us today, even as you're recovering from COVID. And I'm so grateful that you feel good enough for us to have this conversation. It can be so easy for me to minimize what it is that people go through when they suffer. It can be easy for me to just take your presence on the discussion here today for granted. Chuck should just suck it up. Chuck just needs to move through it and work through the pain and work through this. And I know that's not what you're suggesting, and that's not what I'm suggesting. But I think we're in a situation where maybe the modern secular approach is at such odds with what Gregory was talking about. So I think what the challenge I face most from modern secularists is, does God have a right to place suffering and evil in my life? What kind of God is that? And is he worthy of my worship? And I think for the Christian, without explaining the issues away, the answer is yes. What was Job's testimony during his suffering? He said regarding his relationship with God, though he slay me, yet will I worship him. Yet will I be obedient to him. Yet will I sit under his authority. And that's where so many moderns, even if they're enamored with some idea of Jesus, the gentle Jesus, the loving Jesus, the Jesus who came to really improve our lives and our lot, even if people fall in love with that part of Christianity, there's the other part, which is actually being under the authority of God, who dispenses these things as he sees fit and without apology. So let me read a little bit from one of my favorite chapters. I know we've read from it before, and Chuck, I know it's one of your favorite chapters as well. And I won't read the whole passage, but I'll read part of it. And so this is Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And at the beginning of the chapter, it says, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." So, without apology, God has created us and placed us into a world where these things are. And it will be a measure of the genuineness of our love toward him that we respond not only to the good that comes from his hand, but to the calamity. And so I say this again, not meaning to make light of this condition. Chuck, you're talking with us today, recovering, coming from out of having had COVID. And I've already mentioned on other episodes that I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor. And at this point in our lives, I think both of us have lost our parents. And so it's just a simple fact that part of Ecclesiastes has been proven true in our lives. There has been a time for us to rejoice in our relationships with our loved ones. And then there's been a time where we've had to see them suffer, or where we've suffered and where we've had to let them go. And unless the Lord returns, there will be a time for us. And that's an unflinching situation that every worldview has to face. And so I think, without trying to be sadistic, without trying to be morbid, and also without trying to leave us without hope, you brought up that if the scriptures teach that we are in a reality where such things are present, and that without reconciling it or adjusting the books in front of us, God is not apologizing for asking us to walk this path, but he's also not leaving us without hope. He's leaving us with his own son to move through these things. And this is the deep end of the pool. Chuck, we're not debating matters of act and potency. As much as I respect Aristotelian ideas about how to frame reality, we're not dealing with any other theory of everything, some other toe, where we put reality into this nice, sweet, easily encapsulated package with a nice bow on it. No, reality is messy. It includes evil, it includes suffering. And if the Lord should tarry, it will include our death. And yet, God doesn't apologize for this. Now, there's more to say about Thomas Aquinas here and Sadia Gaon, and I do want to get to that, but I also want to just give you a chance to check in with that because, Chuck, we're in really heavy waters, and I know neither of us wish to minimize or demean the suffering that people are going through now and the heartfelt existential angst associated with it. So, how would you talk with somebody who's maybe facing something like that, maybe even right now?
Yeah, and I agree with you. There, there is a sense in which there still is evil, and we have to deal with it. And there is a sense in which some suffering directly results from evil, and we have to deal with that. I think there is a sense in which World War II and the Cold War and the murders of 6 million Jews, the Nazis, and perhaps as many as 10 million of Stalin's own citizens by Joseph Stalin and other stories like that, to maybe to lesser degrees, but still that kind of evil we do have to deal with. We don't want to equate that kind of suffering with the kind of suffering that we're talking about here that can be of some benefit. So I'm glad that you point that out. We still have to deal with the real problem of evil, but I think we also have to understand that evil and suffering, while they at times overlap, and made an important point. You talked about hope and how that kind of hope that often can be seen in the midst of suffering of different kinds, even sometimes in the worst of suffering, is something that we very much can hold on to. We as Christians obviously believe that hope it comes from God. It is a reflection of how God has made us. So even those who are not Christians who still experience that hope, we believe that is God's common grace in the way that we're made and always reaching out for hope. But I think that there is a sense in which without any kind of suffering, we wouldn't also have the corollary of hope. And hope is it's a very powerful emotion. It's something that you don't have to be a Christian to understand. And yet I think it's something that we can use, that idea of hope and that understanding that people have of hope and how terrible it can be when one loses hope. Why we're always encouraging people in difficult circumstances to find areas where they can hope. That's a lot of what counselors are trying to get people to do, is to find areas where they can hope and build on that. There is a sense in which that idea of hope is so key. And frankly, I think that we as Christians, and I know we're getting far off track a little bit of just simply the philosophical concept of the problem of evil, but I think it's important that we as Christians, as we deal with these real questions about suffering and about evil, that we also hold on to and don't forget about real goodness and real hope in the world, the sort of the other side of the coin of these more negative things. And for those who want to tell us there cannot possibly be a God because of the suffering and evil that is in the world, prove to me that there can be a God in such a world. I think the flip side to that is but how can there not be a God in a world where there still is, in the light of all of the craziness and all of the suffering that we experience, that there still is hope. One of my very favorite films, and maybe I've mentioned this before, is a film that takes place, it's an Italian language film, La Vita è Bella, Life is Beautiful is the English title. And of all things, for a movie named Life is Beautiful, it's about a man and his children in a concentration camp during World War II. And the beauty of the hope that he still held on to, even in the light of the most horrific kinds of suffering and the most terrible kinds of things happening. And it's a hope that almost seems crazy. It's like, how does this man who has these children that he's trying to care for, first under the oppression of the Nazis and then later in a concentration camp, how can he still try to do these little things to try to keep his children remembering that life is beautiful, to have that kind of hope? And while the movie itself is not particularly a religious movie, I think that, like many parts of the media it is almost unintentionally religious because it points to the fact that there is hope beyond ourselves. There is hope beyond what we can actually just see in front of us. It points to the fact that there is something transcendent in this world. And in many ways, that kind of hope is proof of the transcendent. And as Christians, we would say it's proof of a transcendent God. And so that's another thing and again, I know we get away from the problem of evil per se, but I think it is something that as Christians, if we focus too tightly, and sometimes we have to, but if we focus too tightly on just simply the intellectual issue of the problem of evil, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but if we focus too tightly on it, we can forget that there is also this flip side to it of hope. And this message of hope that really I believe is the message of the gospel is a message that we see in many ways throughout the world, even in places where people don't necessarily recognize that it's coming from Christ. I will even point out that it's interesting. We've been talking about the book of Job, and I may have mentioned this before, but I went to law school at the University of Wisconsin. A lot of people sometimes joke about Madison being the Berkeley of the Midwest. Very much, the University of Wisconsin, very much a secular institution. And yet, in my legal history course it took, the first text that we read was the book of Job. And the professor, and he was Jewish, but he wasn't practicing. He was a secular Jew. But even there, in making the choice to have the book of Job be the first text that we read in our legal history, what he said is that we have to understand that our entire Western system of jurisprudence is built on this idea that even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of evil, there is such a thing as righteousness. There is such a thing as good. And, all that this professor really was able to come out from that was that therefore we need to be part of that uprightness, that righteousness of the law, the legal system that even in the midst of suffering protects that which is good by creating laws that are designed to be just and fair and good and protect those who behave in such ways. And yet it struck me that, again, this was to some extent some evidence for the idea that there is hope, that there is a God who is a God of hope, that there is a gospel message of good news that isn't always understood, that is often missed by those who do not have faith. And yet, even for those who don't have faith, that gospel message, while they miss the core of it, it has a positive impact. So sorry to get so far off track again, but it just so much struck me that in reading about Gregory the Great and Saadia Gaon and Thomas Aquinas and thinking about this problem of evil and how it relates to suffering, it just struck me how much we have in terms of hope and how strong that idea of hope, even today, even among the most secular of folks, even among people who would deny that there's anything transcendent, and yet they all understand what hope is and that it exists. And I think that's something that we also then need to hold on.
Amen, my friend. So true. We are going to get to Aquinas and the others. I can't go without touching upon something that you mentioned that I think might be for us sitting here and philosophizing. And that was this idea that we might be in the ivory tower, sitting in our comfortable academic chairs, enjoying a catered wine and cheese event, making intellectualized arguments about suffering and evil. But your point was we have to acknowledge the limitations of that. And we can't ever think that we're going to reason ourselves into a satisfactory answer. And so in the first chapter of Job receives the news that his sons and daughters were killed. He receives the news that raiding parties swept down and made off with his wealth. He receives the news that fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up Job's sheep and his servants. And Job's response was to say this. So first of all, Job got up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And then he fell to the ground in worship of God and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And then the last sentence in this first chapter says, in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Now let's just go to the next chapter. Now, Satan has returned and is dialoguing with God, and God says, have you considered my servant Job? He maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. And then the adversary replies to God with another accusation and says, stretch out your hand, strike his flesh and his bones, and Job will surely curse you to your face. And then the Lord said to this adversary, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. Now remember what Job said at the end of chapter 1. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now here's a different response here in chapter 2. His wife said to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Now this isn't Joe Random person. This is Job's helpmeet, his own wife. And he replies to her, you are talking like a foolish woman. Then he asks the question, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And I think we recognize this as a rhetorical question. And the answer, of course, is we shall. We should and we shall accept good from God as well as trouble. Now, there's one more aspect to this that I find very interesting, and that is the response of Job's three close friends. Now, before they enter into the monologues that they're going to enter into that make up the book of Job, and that's funny because you and I were talking before the discussion episode about monologuing and how evil emperors love to monologue, and that gives the good guy time to position himself to defeat the evil emperor. But we have in the situation with Job, we have a social aspect to evil and suffering. And so Job has three friends, dear, close, beloved friends. Although they're going to say things that are not going to be good later, there's no doubt that from a creaturely perspective, Uz, Bildad, Zophar were genuine friends. They loved Job. They heard about his troubles and came to him. They set out from their homes and they met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they came to him from a distance, they couldn't even recognize him. So they began to cry aloud, and they tore their robes, and they sprinkled dust on their heads. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. And so there's this social aspect that is brought in. And I'm not immediately sure what to make of it, except to say that it matters enough to God to include this in the account. Let's take it out of the Bible and let's take it into another situation. You and I have talked about C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien and how they've created worlds and universes, and they populate those worlds and universes with characters who undergo sufferings, who undergo troubles. And we marvel at the realistic feel of those fictional universes and those fictional characters. Suppose that we think about somebody who suffered a great deal. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo suffered greatly by his quest to destroy the One Ring. It was a burden that he had to bear. The work describes Frodo as having been appointed for this task. And in fact, he was appointed for a task that was too great for him, and he could not complete it in his own power and in his own strength. Now, that's not to his miscredit, because there was help, there was aid, there was this social situation. But I think we have to ask, would Frodo, assuming Frodo existed and knew that he was a creation of a person named Tolkien, does Frodo really have, what's this relationship with his creator? Can Frodo complain to Tolkien and say, I'm really not happy with how my part worked out in this whole drama that you constructed? You could think of it, you could imagine Boromir, the member of the Fellowship, who was killed in his quest protecting Frodo. Does he have a view where he can talk to Tolkien and offer a complaint? And so similarly too, does it even make sense for you and I to look at what God has done in creating the world that he has and ultimately expressing a dissatisfaction for it? And I think that's where we see the depth of the quote unquote problem of evil. And so we have two human reactions here, getting back to the scriptures, specifically what happened with Job. We have Job's acceptance of his lot. We have Job's response, acknowledging that he is under God's authority, that God is within his heavenly domain to allow and permit such a treatment of him. And then we have Job's wife who says, curse God and die. Why would you still maintain your integrity? And somehow the problem of evil partitions humanity. And so in that sense, even though you and I started off by saying the problem of evil might not be a problem at all, there's another sense, there's another way in which it might be as a partitioning device, perhaps the preeminent issue in philosophy, and one of the most important issues in theology. And so I'm really excited by this. I was going to get more into some of the thinking here, in particular with how Professor Stump talks about Thomas Aquinas, but I think Aquinas intellectualizes, and something's lost there. And I think also the great thinkers tend to stumble in this intellectualization of something that is beyond such a process. Now, of course, I think the thinkers are probably trying to wrestle with something maybe as much as you or I might. And there are complicating factors. There are variations here. There's differences between Saadia Gaon and Maimonides and Aquinas. And I don't know that the medieval period ended with a single answer, but I think the medieval period ended with an appreciation of the depths of this really interesting and certainly deep problem. This might be in the Marianas Trench of deepest philosophical and theological problems. Chuck, did we make it through this discussion period here and come out in one piece? Because I felt at times like this could overwhelm or consume us. And indeed, we find that in people's experiences. How did we make it out of this, Chuck? What's your evaluation?
I think we did. And it's amazing to me that even as we probe some of the depth of human existence, and this issue of evil is certainly the depths, the Marianas Trench, as you put it, of human existence in many ways, there is always a way back up from those depths of hope that we talked about. And there is some good that comes from exploring those depths, as long as we don't allow ourselves to be dragged down and remain in them. And so I'm glad that we took the time to explore to some extent, not perfectly, not every detail, but to explore some of the depths. And as a result of that, also have a sense of the hope that comes from coming up out of the depths, the hope that Job experienced as well, right? At the end of the book, when he comes up out of the depths and he experiences once again the many blessings he had lost. There's a sense in which we also see that hope in him, but also an understanding of where it is that all of that hope comes from, and all the good things that are happening for him, who is responsible for them. So really good stuff. It's interesting. I'll just one last sort of comment. It's interesting to me that in conjunction with this, I've been reading a book by Brian Fickert, who is a thinker on how do we deal Christianly with issues of poverty. And certainly poverty is an evil, it's suffering, but he also has found that sometimes we tend to turn things on their head, and the Western modern way of thinking, where we think we're solving the problem or we think we're dealing with the problem, doesn't always tend to solve that problem either, and that we have to look more deeply into it as well. And the connections there aren't all 100% clear, but I'm seeing that there are some connections between the reading that I've been doing here on the problem of evil and the reading that I've been doing poverty and Christian responses to poverty. And something I'm going to be continuing to think through as well. So it's really interesting to see how all these things connect and mix together in one's thinking, in one's brain, and sometimes in ways that are confusing, sometimes in ways that also bring a level of clarity. So good stuff. I'm glad that we dealt with it and that we dived into the depths to some